Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Brexit, it is of course the issue that is dominating the race to be the next Prime Minister. Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt have begun giving some detail as to how they will tackle it. Both men have made clear that they are prepared to leave the EU with no deal if they have to. But how different are their approaches? As part of our series over the next few weeks on where the leadership contenders stand on important policy areas, our chief political correspondent Vicky Young has this report.
The race is on. In 4 weeks, a new Prime Minister will be in charge here in Westminster. And the major issue he'll face is, of course, Brexit. March the 29th was the original exit date, but after 2 agreed extensions, the UK is now due to leave the EU on October the 31st. So how are the two candidates for the top job planning to solve the Brexit deadlock? Boris Johnson led the Leave campaign back in 2016 and quit the cabinet over Theresa May's plan. He voted against it twice before backing her in the final failed vote. He says we'll leave the EU on October the 31st with or without a deal, do or die. And he'd withhold the £39 billion divorce payment the UK is due to give the EU. Mr Johnson wants a new deal which would remove the so-called Irish backstop from the withdrawal agreement. That's the exit plan agreed between London and Brussels, but rejected by Parliament. This is extremely controversial because it's the insurance policy to avoid the return of checks at the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Mr Johnson wants the issue dealt with later, but remember the EU has said repeatedly that they won't reopen the agreement. His second option is to seek a new temporary arrangement with Brussels to avoid the need for taxes on goods crossing the border. Mr Johnson would also ramp up plans for no deal. That's leaving without any agreement at all, just in case these other options fail. Now, Jeremy Hunt campaigned for Remain, but did support Theresa May's deal to leave. He says he'd opt for no deal if the alternative is no Brexit. Mr Hunt also wants to make changes to the withdrawal agreement and thinks it is possible to get them made by the 31st of October, but he's called that a fake deadline. He'd delay Brexit beyond that if a new deal was close. He proposes sending a new negotiating team to Brussels, including Conservative MPs who've opposed the current deal and members of Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party. His plans for the Irish backstop, well, Mr Hunt says he's spoken to European leaders who understand that changes are needed. Again, the official line from Brussels is no renegotiation. On top of that, some Conservative MPs are threatening to do anything to block a no-deal Brexit, even if that means bringing down a Tory Prime Minister. Both candidates are hoping that a fresh face in Downing Street will prompt some goodwill from the EU. It's not impossible, but huge political uncertainty lies ahead.
Vicky Young there.
Well, earlier I spoke to the former Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom, who resigned from Theresa May's cabinet 2 days before the Prime Minister herself announced she would be standing down. She's now backing Boris Johnson for Premier, and I began by asking her if the government was right to spend potentially millions more on no-deal planning.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, governments have to prepare for all eventualities. The default legal position is that we leave at the end of October without any arrangements. So, of course, the government needs to prepare for that.
And how likely is that scenario, do you think, your assessment?
Well, nobody wants to leave the EU without arrangements. And, in fact, if it were the case that there were no multilateral arrangements, there'd be lots of bilateral agreements between different EU countries in the UK. But, nevertheless, we do want to have some proper multilateral arrangements between us, and that will be the focus for the next Prime Minister.
Right, well, obviously, if we don't get a Brexit deal, the Bank of England governor has reiterated today that you'd need some kind of preliminary agreement to carry on trading on existing tariffs, so-called GATT Article 24 terms. Why would the EU agree that kind of preliminary deal with Boris Johnson?
Well, it's in the EU's interests as well, and, you know,
More
EU
in our interests, though.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter, Cathy. The fact is EU politicians face the ballot box same way we do. You know, German manufacturers, French farmers, Italian Prosecco makers, you know, Spanish fishermen. There'd be all sorts of people who would have very clear interest in being able to continue to trade.
Will you describe them as your friends? And Boris Johnson used the same terminology, but actually the European Commission's top civil servant said that his election was a, quote, horror scenario. There's not much goodwill towards him, is there?
Well, I don't agree. I mean, you'll always get individuals who are cross with other individuals. I think obviously what's absolutely key to the UK is the excellent relationships we have with the other nations in the European Union. So the heads of government, the other politicians, the other diplomats, the family ties.
Let's talk about the October 31st deadline. Given that the EU has said they won't renegotiate, Parliament has made clear that they would veto leaving without a deal. That is an undeliverable promise, that do-or-die promise, isn't it?
No, it's not. The legal default position is we leave at the end of October, and therefore...
But how?
Because that's the legal default. So if we do nothing, if we all fall fast asleep between now and the 31st of October, we'd wake up the following day and we would have left the European Union. So what Parliament would have to do is to legislate for a different outcome, or indeed bring down the government.
Both of which are quite likely scenarios, aren't they?
Both of them are possible, but actually, in my view, having spent 2 years as Leader of the Commons and understanding the issues of Parliament, it's my opinion that Parliament, as a majority, would wish to see us leave the European Union with sensible measures, and that's what Boris Johnson is committed to doing.
But some of your colleagues have said they would be prepared to bring down the government, trigger a general election.
Well,
what do you say to them?
Well, I don't think that Conservative colleagues would really want to risk a Corbyn government.
Is it important, in your view, to tell the truth in politics?
Absolutely.
So does it concern you? Is there a little scintilla of doubt in your mind that Boris Johnson has been fired twice for lying?
I totally trust Boris to be a Prime Minister who will get us out of the European Union. And
do you
I
trust
also
him
trust
more generally, though? I mean, his former
Yes,
bosses
I do.
didn't.
Yes, I do trust him. I do trust him.
It's odd, isn't it? Because if you look at what one of his former bosses, Max Hastings, has said, he said Johnson would not recognise truth, whether about his private or political life, if confronted by it in an identity parade. That's pretty damning, isn't it?
Well, that's words from a person who doesn't appear to have given any evidence for that. But, you know, I can only speak for myself. I think Boris Johnson has great character. I did those Wembley debates with him back in 2016, and I can absolutely assure you he is a passionate Brexiteer who truly believes in the bright future for this country. I think he's the right person, should we face a general election, to take on what would be a disastrous Labour government.
Andrea Leadsom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the government has formally put a no-deal Brexit back on the agenda with a statement today from the Minister in charge of the Cabinet Office, David Lidington. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is here. Siobhan, what has been happening today?
Well, Cathy, he is, as we know, the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. He has issued, you can see it here, what's called an EU exit preparedness statement, called a prior information notice. A bit technical, but essentially in plain English, he's putting ferry firms and pharmaceutical firms back on notice that the government will soon be looking for no-deal services. They essentially break down into two. The Department for Health will soon be looking for bids to run what they're calling express freight services. You see it here. Now, essentially, they are for Category 1 products, essential medicines, medical products and chemicals. Things, Cathy, that need to be delivered in a very quick turnaround within 24 to 48 hours, including things like organs for transplants. Now, we know that the government is putting its service wants to get it up and running alongside companies like GlaxoSmithKline that already run their own private services or will run them, have hired planes to do so. This is essentially the government wanting to set up its own service to run alongside its existing stockpiling efforts.
And what about those wretched ferries that we remember so well?
That's right. Well, this is the second notice that's gone out today from the Department for Transport, of course, run by Chris Grayling. Now, he is announcing today that he will soon be looking for additional roll-on, roll-off ferry services. In other words, those controversial no-deal ferry services that you mentioned there will soon be back up and running again. Now, they were, of course, fraught with difficulty, weren't they? Seabourn Ferry was the ferry company with no ferries, emergency or otherwise. Chris Grayling was then forced to pay £33 million to Eurotunnel because it successfully sued him for not putting the tender widely out enough. And then he had to pay more than £40 million to the two firms that did get those contracts, Brittany and DFDS. Now, the Department for Transport insisted to me today that they would get it right this time, that they would take longer to run these services. The tenders will be issued in July when we know who the new Prime Minister is. I did ask them whether or not that left seaborne freight open to bidding again. Ironically, the government says it could. They've got no legal wherewithal to stop them, though you can imagine, Cathy, the reaction if Seaborne dared.
Indeed. Well, we'll keep a watch on that between now and October the 31st. Siobhan, thanks very much.
There was a time when you couldn't make it through a normal weekday without hearing about the Conservatives' long-term economic plan. Since Brexit came along, no one's had the headspace, the inclination, perhaps the ability to think about what comes next, what that might look like. But pretty soon, we're going to need to know. Tonight, we move on from dates and deals to look at the Conservative candidates' pledges on tax and spend. What does the next Prime Minister want to do with our money? And how much do they really have to play with? We'll speak to Liz Truss, Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Boris Johnson supporter, in a moment. But first, here's our economics correspondent, Ben Chu, right here. Now, just start us off with those hustings tonight, Ben, because quite a strange statement from Boris Johnson about no deal.
That's right. Boris Johnson at these hustings said that the chances of a no deal are actually extremely low. 1,000,000 to 1 is the odds that he put on them, which if you're a betting person is not very attractive odds. This is despite obviously saying earlier in the week that we'll be out on the 31st of October, come what may, do or die. No deal very much on the table. So what's changed? Well, what his explanation was that he's been getting the impression from Europe and Westminster that there's a sort of new appetite to pass a revised deal by the 31st of October. Now, it has to be said, also another development tonight, David Lidington, the Cabinet Office Minister, has released a statement saying that the no-deal preparation engine is being fired up again, if you like. So all those ferries, if you recall, before the 29th of March, which were requisitioned to cope with a potential fallout of no deal, the stockpiling of medicines, the plans to fly medicines in, all that's happening again. And this will be extremely costly for a lot of firms which are doing this stockpiling. So it's once more into the breach for a lot of these companies and for the UK civil service.
You've been looking at what happens after October the 31st. There is life and it goes on.
Well, interestingly, the two candidates have been making a lot of pledges which are nothing to do with Brexit about the economy. They've been talking about cutting the interest rate on student fees. They've been talking about cutting corporation tax. They've been talking about spending more in schools. They've been talking about spending more on broadband, very much talking as if, you know, there is life after Brexit and this is their plan for the economy. So that's what we looked at today.
I want to fire up our economy, turbocharge it into being the most high-tech, greenest, most pro-enterprise, pro-business economy in Europe.
We need to be supporting the wealth creators in the business sector, because otherwise you're not going to have the dosh to invest. Cut some taxes and you'll get more money in.
The way to the hearts, and more pertinently, the votes, of Conservative Party members has long been a promise of tax cuts. The economic prospectuses of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt reflect that, with both featuring promises of substantial tax reductions prominently in their campaigns for the leadership. But when it comes to tax cuts, as the classicist Boris Johnson might put it, cui bono? Johnson's team have briefed that they intend to raise the higher rate income tax threshold from £50,000 to £80,000 a year. That would mean a windfall for around 2.5 million people. Yet it's also clear that they would be richer people. This shows the UK population ranked from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. The most prosperous tenth of households would enjoy an average gain of around £2,500 a year thanks to this tax cut. For the lower half of the population, there would be no benefit at all. Both candidates have said that they would raise the national insurance threshold in order to help lower income workers too, though they haven't specified the details. If the threshold increased to £12,500, in line with the income tax personal allowance, many lower income families would indeed benefit. Yet economic modelling shows that the biggest cash benefits would once again go to those further up the income distribution. Why? Because lower income families are less likely to be in work and more likely to get a larger share of their income from benefits.
Starting from where we are, increasing the higher rate threshold, even in combination with increasing the point at which you start to pay national insurance contributions, is regressive in the sense that it is much better for people on high incomes than it is for people on low incomes.
Another standout economic pledge from the two candidates is Jeremy Hunt's commitment to cut the corporation tax rate to 12.5%. Hunt suggested yesterday that this would fire up the economy. but experts are not convinced.
There we are, cheers.
Corporation tax rates have already been reduced from around 30% in 2008 to now around 17%. So we already have the lowest rates of corporation tax in the G7 and in fact among developed countries. There's no evidence to suggest that having reduced corporation tax has had any discernible impact on growth or levels of investment.
These tax cuts are expensive too. The estimated price tag for raising the higher rate income tax threshold, £9 billion. Raising the national insurance threshold to £12,500, £11 billion. And cutting corporation tax, £14 billion.
And other tax cuts and spending pledges are tumbling in, from ratcheting up defence spending, to cutting business rates, to hiring more police, to slashing the interest rate on student fees, to bolstering school funding, to rolling out superfast broadband more quickly. Both candidates have suggested they will tap the Chancellor Philip Hammond's multi-billion-pound Brexit war chest to partially pay for these various commitments. But analysts say this language is misleading.
There is no £27 billion Brexit war chest. The current Chancellor has said he's got a maximum level of borrowing for next year, and on current policy we'll have 15 billion of headroom next year against that particular target. But that's only for 1 year, and if they want to borrow more, well then they just should say they want to borrow more. There isn't a war chest to spend.
The candidates also appear to be ignoring demographic pressures on the public finances.
We do know that health spending and to some extent pension spending and social care spending will need to rise substantially over the next decade or two. That will require either further cuts in spending elsewhere, which looks really hard now, or higher taxes elsewhere. It's not compatible with higher spending on defence, for example, or big cuts in income tax, and keeping the health service, the pensions and so on being paid over the next few decades.
We would prefer to see greater transparency in terms of the candidates' fiscal policies more generally. What we don't know is what trade-offs these policies imply in terms of public spending. More broadly, are we expecting to see tax rises elsewhere to pay for these cuts, or indeed increased borrowing? But we haven't had much detail from either of the candidates on those issues.
The way to the hearts of the Tory selectorate might be unfunded promises of tax cuts. But a responsible way to run an economy?
That was Ben Chew. We're joined now by Liz Truss, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and a Boris Johnson back. And you can help us, Liz, perhaps flesh out some of the snippets. The tax plans, first of all, that Boris Johnson mooted. What has now happened to that 40 pence threshold? Those earning up to 80,000. So he's committed to that now, is he?
That's right. And what this is all about is it's about a lot of people on incomes between 50,000 and 80,000 being dragged into the top rate of tax. When the 40 pence rate was first put in, it was only the top 5% that were paying it, the very rich. But now it's people like senior teachers, senior nurses that are dragged into the top rate of tax.
So just
we don't think that's right. We think it's right that the higher rate should apply to people earning over £80,000.
OK, so when he told me last week it was an ambition, now it's been firmed up. Is it a guarantee now that he's going to do that?
Well, it's if
he becomes Prime Minister.
Exactly. It's a policy that we are putting forward. As part of a balanced package, we're also looking at raising the national insurance threshold as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note, Emily, that under this government, we've already raised the basic rate threshold. So basic rate taxpayers are now paying £1,200 less tax.
Understood.
And we think it's right that those
yeah.
people who are earning incomes between 50 and 80,000 shouldn't be dragged into the higher rate tax
so that is a windfall,
which was never the intention.
That is a windfall
never the intention
for the 2.5 million
policy.
of the richest people in the country, and you're comfortable with that?
This is about taking people out of higher rate tax.
It's a
that
windfall
shouldn't
for the
be
2.5 million of the richest people in the country. Are you comfortable with that?
I am comfortable with that as part of a balanced package.
Because the national insurance also helps.
In addition to what we've done on basic rate, in addition to what we are looking at on national insurance.
But that wasn't Boris Johnson doing it.
It's very important on taxes. This is people's money we're talking about.
Right.
This is about the government taking money from people that they have earned.
Right,
and I think
this is
it's
his
right
headline. Sorry,
that
Liz,
people
just to
keep
clarify,
more of their own money.
this is his headline, though. This is the one thing we've heard about, that it is a windfall for the richest people and it will help rich pensioners most of all. The prosperous tenth of households will enjoy an average gain of £2,500 and the lower half of the population will have no benefit from this at all. You're comfortable with that?
Well, I'm very proud of this government's record of raising the basic rate threshold. We've
We're
already
talking about
cut
the government
taxes.
that you're supporting with
We've
Boris
already
Johnson.
cut taxes for the lowest earners. And now what I'm saying is it's unfair that people earning £55,000, senior teachers, should be paying a higher rate of tax.
So the lower half of the population under this plan will see no benefit at all. It's no wonder he doesn't want to have a general election, isn't it? Get absolutely thrashed by most of the country.
We're also looking at raising the national insurance threshold as well.
Which you said.
It's part of a balanced package of policies. But in my view, it is wrong that people earning £50,000 and above, who previously wouldn't have been paying higher rate tax,
Let's look
under
at
the
balanced
Labour
package,
government,
then.
more and more of them were dragged into higher rate taxes.
It's not just tax cuts, is it? It's spending as well. Big infrastructure spending he's talked about. He's fully behind Heathrow now. You'll be pleased with that.
I am a big supporter of expanding Heathrow.
HS2, he's behind that now too.
Well, we are doing a review of HS2.
Because you're not a fan of that.
As I've said before, the government is looking at this as part of a zero-based capital review. The final decision will be made in December. And what the focus of our policies are is about increasing economic growth, making sure we're investing
He likes
where
HS2 though,
economic
doesn't he?
growth is delivering the highest level.
And housing, he said this evening, there's no way you should build on the green belt. It's going to hurt Tory councillors, stop them getting re-elected. Do you disagree with that? You'd like to build on the green belt?
Well, I personally think there are some areas that are brownfield land that we should be building on in areas near London. But of course, I'm a big supporter of green spaces, and that's very important as well.
But you've also said build on the green belt, and he doesn't think you should, right?
Well, it's not his policy to do that.
Right. OK, so you've got big spending, you've got big tax cuts, and you just heard Paul Johnson of the IFS say there is no Brexit war chest. So you work in the Treasury. Where's that money coming from?
Well, there is fiscal headroom, and Paul Johnson did acknowledge that. There's 26 billion of fiscal headroom. We can hit our fiscal targets, and we still have that money to spend.
Let's spell out what that headroom means, because it's confusing, isn't it? The headroom is not a war chest. It's money that is either being saved up for no deal, which would have to be spent in the case of no deal, or else it's going to pay down the deficit. So if you spend it, you're not meeting your fiscal pledges.
Well, it's certainly true that that money could be used to pay down the deficit.
And it won't be
used. It could be used for tax cuts, or it could be used for spending increases. But I think it's important to note on Brexit that we've already spent £4 billion getting the country ready for Brexit, so on new immigration systems, on new systems at our ports.
And we've heard that David Lidington's doing that again tonight.
That headroom that we're talking about is actually specifically money for a fiscal buffer. So it's for precisely things like tax cuts in the event of a departure on the 31st of October. That's precisely what that buffer is for,
So you think Philip Hammond, your boss, left that buffer for tax cuts on the day that we left the EU on no deal?
He's been very honest about this. He said...
No, he said, sign up to my pledge. That was what he said. The Hammond fiscal rule, deficit to be below 2% of GDP by 2021. He asked the candidates to commit to that. Boris Johnson hasn't. Can he commit to that now?
What I think is important is that we're paying down debt as a proportion of GDP.
So he won't commit to that?
We previously had a deficit issue as a country. We were running a massive deficit. We've brought that down. Our issue now is our debt as a proportion of GDP is high.
So he won't commit to the Chancellor's pledge? Because you were Mrs Austerity. You know, you've been in the Treasury. You've seen how hard your government has worked at austerity, for better or for worse. And you're now saying, oh, actually, forget that.
Well,
we don't need to meet the pledge anymore.
I think it's been incredibly important bringing down the deficit. But our real threat now is our debt levels are too high. And it means that if we face an economic shock, we will be in trouble. And that's why we need to commit to bringing down debt as a proportion of GDP.
So if we're having an economic shock, you're going to give tax cuts out. That's your first move, is it?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure we're absolutely prepared for Brexit. As I said, we've spent the £4 billion, but what we need to do now is make sure businesses are prepared, make sure we're ready to bring forward investments. We've got a clear economic plan to do that. But also, yes, making sure that we do have the economic support in place for whatever eventuality happens.
I don't need to spell out to you that businesses aren't nearly prepared because they don't know what plan you have for Brexit. Just tonight...
Well, Boris has been very clear, and he's the only candidate that's been clear, that we will leave on the 31st of October, deal or no deal.
Okay.
And that will give a much clearer message to businesses than the constant delay and limbo we've had. And what we know is that businesses have been holding back investment. They're not sure about the future.
Liz, I'll be really honest, we don't understand it. We just don't understand it. He said we'll leave, deal or no deal. Then tonight he said there was a 1 in a million chance of no deal. Then he admitted that he couldn't have a transition period without access from the EU, without signing the withdrawal agreement. And then he didn't even manage to answer the question this evening about whether he would rule out suspending Parliament to make sure that we come out on the 31st. So no, genuinely, we don't have a clue.
I think it's extremely clear. He has said we will leave on the 31st of October. And he's the only candidate.
Parliament or not?
He's the only candidate. He doesn't want to do those archaic manoeuvres with Parliament.
So he's ruling it out?
He wants to bring Parliament with him. He wants to leave on the 31st of October. But unlike Jeremy Hunt, who's the other candidate in this race, who has said he would be willing to conscience a delay, Boris is very clear. A delay would be a disaster. And I believe we should have left already, that delaying from the 29th of March has not benefited us. It's just created more limbo.
Just clarify for me, and I'm sorry if I'm sounding stupid, he's definitely ruling out proroguing or suspending Parliament. Is that right?
That's right.
OK, so we are then going to come out with 20 days, because you've committed to the 31st, 20 working days to either sign the old deal, which he's already said was dead, or to get a new deal, which the EU doesn't know about.
What we know about the EU is that negotiations tend to run up against the deadline. And the reason I believe we were not successful in getting concessions on the backstop last time is that we didn't put that final time pressure on. We took no deal.
Pressure.
No, we took
no deal. They gave us extensions.
We took, exactly, that took the time pressure off. What we need to do is be serious about leaving on the 31st of October. That's why Boris has made such a firm pledge. That focuses minds on getting a deal that can suit both the EU and the UK in the time frame.
Why the EU's mind would be focused when he understands there can be no transition period without signing withdrawal agreement, and he's just said tonight that there's only 1 in a million chance of no deal. Why would the EU's mind be focused enough for them to come to the table and suddenly open up a brand new deal because he's committed to the date? Why would they do that?
Because we are serious about the deadline, and we're not going to extend. He's not going to seek an extension. Last time what happened is we sought
it will change the EU's mind.
Last time we sought an extension, and that took the time pressure off those negotiations. That will not happen this time. That is Boris Johnson's very, very clear pledge. And Jeremy Hunt has already indicated that he'd be willing to conscience a delay. I think that's a mistake, because I don't think there'll be the time pressure to get those negotiations concluded and get a deal that is suitable for both the EU and the UK.
You've been in the Treasury. You're a fiscally responsible adult. You can stand by a man who has wasted money, 52 million on the Garden Bridge, on 61 on a cable car, an airport feasibility study that costs 5 million, who's broken promises on whether he supports Heathrow or not. I'm not even talking about character, I'm not even talking about morality, I'm just talking about a man who constantly says things when he's London Mayor about, you know, cutting taxes and cutting council tax and then doesn't. Why would you, who's got this sort of...
Boris
this
was
Treasury
a very...
experience, trust that?
Boris was a very successful Mayor of London. He was incredibly pro-business. He attracted new business into the city. He built lots of houses in London.
52 million waste on the Garden Bridge.
He built lots of houses in London.
Water cannon that he couldn't even use.
He was successful. He lit London on the world stage. And what he wants to do now is do what he did for London for the rest of the country, level up on infrastructure spending, make sure we're rolling out fibre to rural areas, to towns, to turbocharge our economy. London's an incredibly successful city.
Yeah.
It's as productive as Germany, Emily. Can you imagine if other cities in the UK were able to grow as fast because they had the infrastructure. Leeds is currently the largest city in Europe without its own mass transit system.
Yeah, because he said 1,000 more police on the beat, didn't he, in London?
We can
and that number actually fell by
country.
1,000.
And he cut crime while he was London mayor
And he
as
said
well.
he'd bring down rough sleeping, and that actually rose by, I think it was 130% in London over the course of his time. So I'm just wondering how you choose his successes in London when so many of those promises, pledges that he made, were broken to the capital.
Well, he had a massively good record on crime. He cut the murder rate, he increased house building, and he made London feel great about itself, which I think is really important.
Liz Truss, thank you very much.
Thanks
for coming in.